Okay. Okay. Yeah. And it's Seth B that you added, so that's my phone. Okay.
All right. I think we're up. I think we're good. We've had some tech difficulties. I see that. I think Randy. I don't know if you're still hanging out with us, but here we are. This is the first time I've ever used this platform, so please bear with me. I apologize.
No
Here I have with me. Usually this is an episode. I do things solo. I'm by myself, and I just kind of talking to the wind. Maybe I have a few people that listen. I'm not sure, but this time is special. We have Seth Bloomsburg with us this morning, I guess it is, and your Pacific time, is that California, Washington, Oregon? Where are you at?
Yep. Yeah. I'm living near Seattle, Washington.
Okay. Cool. Well, everybody kind of that listens to the show, watches it, knows who I am. So why don't you introduce yourself to everyone, and then kind of tell us about your background a little bit as a Christian.
Well, I've been a Christian basically my whole life. I can't really remember a time when I wasn't, because I was converted when I was about 4 years old, and I've never backslidden or looked back. I've had significant issues or significant questions about, how do I know Christianity is true? What about science and that kind of thing? I kind of went through that in high school, but finally when I graduated high school and got into college, I started kind of teaching myself a lot more. So went to Logos School in Moscow, Idaho, which is a classical Christian ACCS school. And they provided me a good foundation for just kind of learning and teaching myself. And then I also ultimately ended up at New St. Andrews College, also in Moscow, Idaho. And about 10 years ago, I started pretty seriously studying theology and philosophy for myself. So I started with books like C.S. Lewis's Miracles, Van Til's The Defense of the Faith, and became pretty convinced of the Van Tillian presuppositional perspective. And ultimately, when I went to New St. Andrews College, I did my undergraduate on presuppositional apologetics. I took an atheist's book. He's an atheist named Richard Carrier, and he has a book called, I think the title is just Why I'm Not a Christian, which is this, the same as Bertrand Russell's, the title of Bertrand Russell's book. And he just describes in it arguments why he isn't a Christian. And basically, I just took the presuppositional methodology and applied it to that particular opponent, and explained why, as Bonson says, the only proof for the existence of God is that without God, you can't prove anything. And so that's been kind of my background as far as my Christianity and how I reasoned about the faith and how I got here.
Did you ever have the pleasure of interacting with Richard Carrier actually directly?
Occasion, actually, there was some get together. I think it was of the Atheist Society or something in Pullman, Washington, which is only about 8 miles away. And he just happened to be there. I'm not sure he had been here before or even really visits that often. But there happened to be an opportunity to talk with him. And so as succinctly as I could, I don't quite remember what my question was at this point, but or what his answer was. But I did get a chance to ask him about his atheist viewpoint. So,
yeah, him and I had an article exchange, and I found out real quick that he doesn't he doesn't play by the rules when it comes to language. That's for sure.
Yeah, he's interesting to be sure.
Yeah. Anyway, we are here because Seth and I got into a conversation on Facebook about the first way, Thomas's first way. Really, it was the argument from motion, and I summarized it in 3 premises with a conclusion. And the premises were as follows. They were just there. There are some things in motion. Nobody really denies that unless they're a solipsist. Premise 2, but that which is in motion is put into motion by another. Premise 3, infinite regress is impossible. Conclusion, therefore, a first mover exists. Now, Seth, as I understood it, you had objected to the argument by noting how the conclusion, if it ends at a first mover at all, must end at only a natural first mover. Am I
Yeah.
getting that
So
right?
as a presuppositionalist, they frequently take issue with the way that most theistic arguments are formulated. I actually don't think that the theistic arguments, and I agree. I don't think that the way that the typical theistic arguments are formulated are valid at all. And I think actually Kant's and Hume's criticisms are really very good. I think. Because one of their main criticisms, and I'm just speaking generally from what I've read and heard summarized, what I've read of their own works and heard summarized of their own views. So I'm not always going to be able to remember, this specific criticism goes to this guy. But generally speaking, their criticisms come into one of the main criticisms is those arguments all deal with natural causation. So you have a natural hand, natural stick, natural ball that causes motion. Even if the argument was valid in the sense of it was established by the premises, at the end of the day, it's only talking about natural motion. It's not talking about supernatural. It's talking about natural causation, not supernatural causation. So I think it's a total category error for them to conclude that actually proves the existence of a transcendent God. I think it only proves the existence, if it proves anything at all, of an immanent God.
Can you define maybe a little bit what you mean for our listeners, and really for me, so that I understand how you're employing the distinction between natural and supernatural? What do those two? What do they mean? What is natural and what is supernatural?
The creator. Basically, I could summarize it by saying it's the creator-creature distinction. God is supernatural, and His creation is natural.
Okay, so do you believe that we can know God through that which has been created?
Yes, I do affirm what Romans 1 says, and I think what often trips people up is I think what Romans 1 is talking about is natural revelation. I don't think it has natural theology in view there at all.
Well, okay, so whenever you say we can know God through something that is in this creation or in this world,
Okay.
You'd basically be saying, as far as I understand it, that Hume and Kant's objection to the theistic proofs are invalid, because Kant would be, if your distinction between natural and supernatural correspond at least loosely to the phenomenal and the noumenal, Kant would be placing God in the noumenal. There's no way to have knowledge of God in the phenomenal. We only know things as we perceive them. Knowledge of God doesn't come to us. We can't know Him through the things that have been made according to Kant.
Basically, I would say it this way: just because I think Kant's and Hume's criticisms of the theistic arguments are valid doesn't mean that I think what they replace it with is valid or is justifiable. So at the end of Hume, Hume at the end of I forget which book it is. I think it's the Inquiry, where at the very end he basically answers the objection. Well, if we can't know, induction or the existence of the soul or anything else, we're just left in skepticism. So what do you do, right? And he basically says, well, you just go play billiard with your friends. He is left in skepticism, but I don't think that's what we're left with. What Hume and Kant are doing is critiquing bad arguments for the existence of God. They are not proving that God can't exist, or that there are not proofs for God's existence.
Right, but I think one of the reasons why Kant objects to the theistic proofs is he's doing so on the basis of his idealism and that distinction that he makes between the phenomenal and the noumenal realms. But I actually want to get back to the argument itself so that I can make some qualifications. I was listening to a debate yesterday between Copleston and Russell, Bertrand Russell.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard that. I shared it. Yeah, it's actually just the 18-minute portion that they took out of the discussion at large, and but it has to do with the argument from contingency.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that Copleston mentions there, and I think that applies to this conversation as well, is that when you come to the conclusion of a theistic proof like this one, like the argument from motion, or you could go to way number 3, which I think is the argument from contingency, and you come to a first mover, or you come to an uncaused cause, that which is necessary. The question needs to be whether or not the first mover is contingent or necessary. And you would essentially be saying that the first mover is contingent because it's natural.
Yes, and I think that's where our discussion kind of there was some ships passing in the night at that point, because I was trying to make the point that if you have the creator-creature distinction background, if you prove hypothetically that there's a first mover within the natural course of creation, it's necessary in the sense that it's the first mover in the natural causal chain of creation. It is not necessary in the sense that it always existed, because it's a first mover, it's a natural mover, it's not the creator God. So if you limit your discussion to just natural causation and assuming the proof is valid, well then of course it's a necessary, the first mover necessarily exists. But if you're talking more broadly about the entire discussion of does God exist, and what about his creation, well then it's not necessary, because it's contingent on the existence of a supernatural creator God.
Right, but the conclusion here is for a first mover of the natural causal series.
Okay. Yes.
That's where the conclusion gets you. Now, if you have a first mover of the natural causal series, it has to be necessary. Do you see the connection?
Necessary.
There?
Okay.
Well, something that's necessary has its existence through itself. It doesn't have the explanation or the reason for its existence is not through something else prior to it or underneath it. It's in itself. So where we get the idea of self-existence or aseity in God. When I say that something is necessary, I'm saying that it exists in and of itself. The definition, it's an analytic proposition. When we say God, we're saying that which exists, right? Okay. And we're identifying the essence and existence in God.
If that's how you define it, then no, I don't think the first mover exists necessarily. Like if you want to define necessary as its self-existence or has existence through itself, then no, I don't think the first mover is necessary in any sense.
Well, but let me just
go ahead.
Well, let me interject. The first mover has to be necessary in order to be the first mover. If it's not necessary, then it's not the first mover.
Okay. At least the way you formulated it, I don't think that's in the proof there. But I mean, even if you don't accept that, I mean, I think there are other problems with the proof.
And let me just qualify. These are metaphysical arguments, and maybe something that would be helpful for listeners as well is that when you're dealing with metaphysics, it's different than dealing with something like physics, where you're dealing with a particular area of the world under some area of study, Metaphysics deals with being qua being, so being as being. And so these arguments apply in that mode, in being as being. So we're looking at being as being, which means that when you make the distinction between natural or supernatural, you're describing two different types of being.
Yeah.
You're describing natural being, and then you're describing supernatural being, or that which is, right? Supernatural isness or being, and natural isness or being. And these arguments are arguing for a conclusion that applies to being as being itself. So
That's
it's not just
where I would take issue with it, because I think what's absolutely necessary when we talk about being or existence is you have to make the very first distinction you have to make is, are we talking about creature being or creator being? Because that's the very first metaphysical distinction that's made in Scripture, and all sorts of things fall out of that, because you can't just, I don't think that the concept of being in general is a sensible concept, because just because something is true of God doesn't mean it's true of creation. Just because something is true of creation doesn't mean it's true of God necessarily, depending on what you're talking about. So I don't think that the concept of being in general even makes sense. You have to ask, what kind of being are we talking about? Are we talking, from the very outset, you have to ask, are we talking creature being or creator being?
Well, and when you're talking about kinds of being, you're already distinguishing being according to diverse or different genera, species, and that even that predicate really doesn't apply to God as he is in himself. God is not a kind of being. God is being itself. And so nothing else is like that.
I mean, I don't think you have to have genus and species. I mean, we can just say, well, he's the kind of being he is creator being. I mean,
sure. I mean, if you're talking about right, in an analogical sense, I mean, yeah, we predicate things about God, but our predication is all analogical.
Yeah.
And so you're saying that being doesn't apply to God at all. Well, then how do we talk about?
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if you can't talk about being in general or being in itself. You have to talk about, before you're going to talk about being and then draw a conclusion about that being. You have to know, is it creator or creature? That's the first question you always have to ask.
Right, but my problem is that when you're talking about creaturely being, right?
Yeah.
Creaturely being is contingent being.
Yes.
You agree with that? So,
oh yeah,
since creaturely being is contingent being, it must require a cause in order to be.
Yes.
Okay. Well,
I agree. So
that's the summons. That's the sum and substance of the argument.
Okay. Well, yeah, I agree. Everything. I think by definition, everything in creation is contingent upon God. Now, there are different senses of necessary which we can use within creation, like, a square necessarily has four sides. Well, that's a different usage of the term necessary. So I'm not saying the word necessary can never in any sense be applied to a creature. But if you're talking about being in existence and contingency on its very existence, well then yes, everything in creation is contingent, and everything in God is necessary.
Right. Yeah, we're talking about metaphysical contingency and metaphysical necessity. We're not talking about suppositional necessity or
Sure,
what do you call it? Necessity of consequence or anything like that.
Yeah.
So, but you just said all contingent being is contingent. I mean, it therefore requires a cause, right? I mean, all being that is created is what I meant to say is contingent, and therefore requires a cause. Do you think it is valid to say there is contingent being, therefore there must be a necessary cause?
Depending on how you fill that out, yes, I could agree with it. My issue is with theistic arguments is typically on how they're formulated. Like with the example of just take the example of the design argument. If somebody says, well, everything is designed, therefore there's a designer, that's not detailed enough for me to really critique it much, I don't think. Because, sometimes the transcendental argument can be very simplistic in its formulation. If somebody says, well, I don't believe in God because I don't think it's reasonable. Well, if I had 10 seconds to talk to that person, I would tell them, well, if it's a chance universe, your arguments against God don't make sense. Therefore, God has to exist. So I would distinguish between an argument being formally invalid versus just being sketchy. So if somebody says, well, contingent beings need a necessary being, okay, well, yeah, sure. By definition, something that's contingent, it depends on something that is necessary. Sure. I mean, I agree with that so far. I'm just saying the way that the arguments are typically formulated and the way yours were formulated, I think they're just, it's not just the natural supernatural distinction. It has to do with quantification fallacies, sometimes just ambiguity of meaning, that kind of thing. That is what I think is fatal to all the theistic arguments that are as they are typically formulated. It's not just the fact that they're talking about necessity and contingency.
Well, what's the substantial difference between the first way and us just saying, well, there is contingent being, therefore there must be a necessary cause of that contingent being?
I would
What's
say
the substantial difference?
I would say, generally speaking, the difference would be this. It's not so much that we observe order and then can rationally and justifiably say, well, there must be an orderer. It's more like you have to presuppose the Trinitarian God of Scripture as the orderer. Otherwise, your definition of order doesn't make sense. So it's a little bit it's a little bit backwards. It's not like we say, well, there's some brute facts in creation that we can understand and know that they're ordered. Therefore, we know that there's God. It's more like we have to presuppose God's existence. Otherwise, our attempts at discovering the order in creation are unintelligible and don't make any sense.
Well, so your problem with the argument really is then definitional with respect to the conclusion. So first mover just doesn't.
Not quite. I don't think that the premises can get off the ground, as it were, unless we already presuppose that God exists. If we try to define contingency and necessity, I don't think that those terms can be made sense of unless we already know that God exists.
Okay, sure. The fact that the premises assume the existence of God is really not in question.
Well,
the very fact that there are some things in motion. What's that?
But then it's a circular argument. I think you're kind of stuck either way. Either if you presuppose that God's existence in the premises, like you just said that you did, well, then you're presupposing God and then concluding God exists.
There's arguments assume things all the time. It doesn't mean that like they assume the functionality of language and the grammar and the construction of the argument. They assume that those things are valid without arguing for them. That doesn't mean they're circular. That just means they're assuming things. Circular reasoning would be if P1 or premise 1 was was saying, was starting with the laws of logic in order to end with the laws of logic, was stating something like God exists, therefore God exists, right? That would be an explicit, really daft example of circular reasoning. But just to make assumptions, if the premises make assumptions, that doesn't mean that the argument is guilty of the fallacy of circular reasoning.
Right, and I would distinguish between the vicious circularity that you're talking about and the presuppositional circularity of, well, you have to assume something before an argument works. And I would say you have to not just make generic assumptions about reality, you have to make the specific assumption that God exists before arguments can even work at all. Because if you're going to assume the validity of the laws of logic, well, let me put it this way. let's take your theistic argument and see if it can prove anything to a Hindu. If you were trying to convince me as a Hindu that this is a valid argument, well, I could just say, in terms of my worldview, and I've read the Upanishads, I could show you, as it were, chapter and verse where they say this, that logical distinctions are illusions. So your distinction between contingency and necessity, premise 1, premise 2, validity versus invalidity, those terms in my worldview are totally meaningless. And not only that, but
right. Well, I would just say they violate the principle of explosion. I mean,
well, yeah. Well, as a Hindu, I would say, so what? That's an invalid. Your distinction between your discussion of the principle of explosion. I mean, logic is illusion. Logic is an illusion. What does that prove to me?
Well, you're utilizing logic to say that logic is an illusion. So that's what I would point out to the Hindu. But
well, sure.
But
right, and so that's actually what I would say to the Hindu too. I would tell him, hey, your premise, or your worldview is self-refuting because you don't presuppose God's existence, and you presuppose the existence of Brahman and all is Maya or illusion. Those are your presuppositions. You can't even marshal an argument to demonstrate or prove your own worldview. It's self-refuting. You use Lewis's.
Yeah, but really they're denying something more immediate to the discussion, right? They're denying the laws of logic, which even allows them to make an intelligible adjudication as to what they even believe. So they would need to first accept the laws of logic in order to even make the concept of God intelligible, which means the laws of logic would be prior to their apprehension of God.
Well, a couple things there. First of all, I think every worldview is completely incapable of justifying their use of the laws of logic. So I would just extend it further and say Christianity is the only worldview in which the laws of logic can be made sense of. And second of all, is to your last comment about being aware of God's existence. I think everyone's aware of it. Romans 1 says that all men know God. All men have true, justified belief in God. And what they do is they suppress that truth in unrighteousness. They convince themselves that they don't actually believe it. And then they come up with some other worldview like Islam or atheism or Hinduism, which replaces that belief, and they say they believe it and try to live in terms of it.
Right, but they are denying fundamental laws of thought, which even allows them to make the concept of God intelligible.
Right, because
so if you just walk up to a Hindu and you mention God or the triune God of Scripture, they are denying the principles which they require in order to make that concept that you just communicated to them intelligible. So they need to presuppose the laws of logic, as it were, or they need to submit to the laws of thought in order to apprehend what Seth is trying to communicate to them. Are you there? I think we might have lost him.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Can you hear me? I can't hear me. Uh-oh. Well, we lost Seth. Maybe we'll get him back here in a little bit, and we'll see if we can conclude or finish up this discussion. Let's see. Is he back? Let's see if I can add him to.
Sorry about that.
Alrighty, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
All right. I just want to restate what I said to you when you. Right. When Seth goes up to a Hindu and communicates to them the concept of God or the triune God of Christianity, they need to accept and submit to the laws of logic, which are more fundamental in their thought than the concept God. And I say they're more fundamental because it's only by something like the laws of logic that they are going to even make sense of that concept that you're trying to communicate to them.
Okay. What I think is going on there is there are two different things going on in the unbeliever's worldview. There's the worldview that he says he believes in, and then the worldview that he knows and suppresses and in some sense acts in accordance with psychologically. So even people who believe that there are no moral absolutes still think that things like genocide are wrong. So they still act.
Mhm.
So the fact that they condemn genocide means they act psychologically like God exists and man is made in the image of God and murder is wrong. They act that way psychologically frequently. But their espoused worldview doesn't allow them the justification for believing that or for knowing that. So what I would say is going on with that Hindu right there is I'm telling him, I'm explaining to him that, God exists and here's how he knows he exists. In terms of his worldview, he can't prove anything, including the claim that his religion is true or my religion is false or that my religion is true or whatever.
Right. I
I
understand that. I understand that. What I'm trying to get to is that it would be invalid for you to discuss something in a logical manner with a Hindu because they deny the laws of logic. In other words, you just said you're you're reasoning with a Hindu, but you said the problem with the Hindu is that they deny the laws of logic or logical distinctions. So what makes you and I different then in that regard?
Because I can still appeal to it because regardless of what he says he believes, I know that he still knows God and he still knows the revelation of God is still pressing upon him from the facts of creation, from his own conscience. He already knows God exists. I'm just trying to point out to him, he knows that, whether he realizes or not, that, everything else is known in terms of God's existence. So I can still appeal to the laws of logic because those are facts that he can still know in terms of the worldview that he's suppressing, in terms of his knowledge of God that he's suppressing. So I can still appeal
but he knows through a medium. He knows through a medium. He knows instrumentally. That's what Romans 1 says, that Hindu knows God through that which has been made. That's an instrumental thought.
That's why I appeal to, the facts of logic, I might appeal to the facts of archaeology or the facts of scripture itself, but the fact it remains that I can still appeal to facts out there because he still knows the God that created them. I'm just showing him that he can't know anything in terms of his worldview, but if he accepts my worldview, it makes sense of everything that he wants to make sense of.
Right. So you're just reducing his worldview to absurdity.
Yes.
Right. Which I think
mean he can't, because he already knows God. But that doesn't mean he can't communicate with me, and it doesn't mean I can't communicate with him because he knows God. He knows the worldview he's suppressing. He knows the God that he's suppressing. He knows the truth that he's suppressing. So I can still appeal to it and its relation to other facts in order to show him that God exists and that he really knows him and really needs to repent.
Right. And all a theistic proof is doing is it's showing them how they know God through that which has been made.
Well, the way they're typically formulated, they're all invalid. So I wouldn't want to use an invalid.
Well, how are they all invalid?
Well, we can go after the one that you gave earlier.
For sure.
So I already pointed out the natural supernatural distinction that's a problem. There are other problems with it. For example, talking about the causes in the world don't tell me anything necessarily about causes for the world. So you can talk about natural causation within creation, and it's just a category leap. It's a non sequitur. The premises don't prove the conclusion. If you conclude from that causes in creation say anything about the causes for creation. And second of all, there's nothing about the proof itself that actually does prove that there's only one mover. One of Hume's criticisms is, well, there could be multiple movers. Why can't there be multiple movers within within the natural order of creation, because it's simply a category error to say that every event must have a cause. Therefore, there is one cause for all events. That's a quantification fallacy. And it.
Oh, no, of course, absolutely not. That's not true at all. So when you're talking about a first mover, you're obviously talking about a fundamental mover, and we're not even talking about just a linear chain of causality here, but also a hierarchical chain of causality also. And so when you're talking about a first mover, you're talking about that which is first in priority. And there cannot be multiple first movers for a number of reasons. That would be like saying, I mean, would you grant, for example, that there could be multiple necessary beings?
Well, sure. I mean, they could be mutually necessary.
Okay, see, that's the problem, is I don't think we're understanding what it means to say that something is necessary. If say you were to posit or opine that there are two necessary beings, there is something that makes them different from one another, right? That's why there's two.
Well, the three persons in the Trinity, and those are all necessary.
But it's one being subsisting in three persons. It's not three beings. Right. That would be tritheism. Yeah. Okay, so when we're talking about two necessary beings, if you were to opine two necessary beings, it's a nonsense statement at bottom, is because you have to have distinguishing factors in either of those beings in order to have two, right? I mean, what makes them different? What would make them different?
I'm just saying that the proof in what there are two different things going on here. First of all, I can agree that X is a nonsense concept or it doesn't make sense. That's different than saying your proof proves X. Okay, I'm saying that the proof, the way you formulated it, I think allows. It doesn't prove that there is one necessary first mover. It allows for multiple first movers as
well. To say no. Well, to say first mover, to say necessary first mover is to proffer a tautology. A first mover must, by definition, be necessary.
Why?
Because if it's not the first mover, then there's something else behind it that moves it. Do you know what I mean? Well, and if you want to say, well, there's four equal first movers, then there are parts in each of those movers that distinguish them one from another, which means they are moved by another. They are caused by another. And so they would not be first in priority. Something else would be first in priority, whether that be a part of them. So I'm not denying that first mover requires us to flesh out a definition of what that is or to explain to someone what that is. All the argument does is conclude at a first mover. But I think if we actually consider what that is, a first mover means that there's nothing else behind it.
Okay.
Otherwise, it would not be first.
Okay. Well, that goes to one of Hume's other criticisms when it comes to the supposedly necessary truth that every event has a cause. Well, you don't have acquaintance with all causes or all events. So how do you know that each event has its own cause? You can't know that.
Well, Hume never actually denied that each event has a cause. He denied that we could know what the cause is. So he's not denying the law of causality. He's denying the assumed nature of causality. He's not denying that there's a cause altogether. Even Hume would say that would be ridiculous.
No, and at least from what I remember, I think you're talking about two different things. When he talks about his general critique of causality, he admitted, well, maybe there's a reason for justifying the principle of induction. I don't know of one, and I just explained logically how the typical explanations don't make any sense. But obviously, he does say, well, maybe there is a justification for the principle of induction, but I don't know what it is. I want to see that.
Right. So he's right. He's denying knowledge of it. He's not denying
the critiques of the theistic arguments.
No. I agree with that, but I'm just saying that Hume's skepticism there doesn't really apply in that regard. Because what I'm not.
Because he's saying his criticism of the theistic argument is that in order to make the proof work, you have to know for certain that every event has a cause, and he's simply saying no one has acquaintance with all causes or all events, so you can't know that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can know that it has a cause. You just can't know what the cause is. That's what he's saying.
How do you know it does?
What's that?
How do you know? How do you know every event has a cause, even if you don't know what the cause is?
Every effect has a cause. It's an analytical statement because that's what an effect is. So an effect is just that which has a cause.
So it's true because it's a tautology?
No, it's an analytical statement. It just is right, an effect is defined as that which has a cause. That's what an effect is. Without I mean, let's put it this way.
It's just you're making it true by definition. How do you know it has application to every fact in reality?
Well, that's all the argument needs, is it to be true by definition. Now you can go ahead.
I'm talking about the premises. So this is one. Here's my issue with the whole cause and effect thing. Let's say that let's say that part of my argument was all A has a B, and you say, well, how do you know that? And it's like, well, it's analytically true. I mean, we define every A as having A, B. Okay, well, at that point, you're not really saying anything because you don't.
Well, that's not what's going on. I'm saying that if something is an effect,
okay, hold on.
Then it requires a cause.
Okay, hold on. Just give me a second. If I say every A has a B, okay, I don't know that B, because it's just something that I'm saying is analytically true up in my head because I've defined it that way. I don't know that either B or A has any true application to reality. So if you want to say, you can say cause and effect. I mean, if you just describe what a cause is and an effect is, I can say, okay, that makes sense. I know what you mean. But as soon as you say, well, it's analytically true, then you've kind of removed it from reality. You're just saying, well, it's true by definition. Well, then how do you know it has application to reality? Because you don't have acquaintance with all reality to know that it's analytically true. It's kind of like with all bachelors are unmarried. I mean, if you just define it that way, well, then how do you know that actually has application to what we call bachelors in the real world?
Okay, so there's a few problems there, obviously. The first is that I could just ask you, is creation an effect?
Actually, that would be my problem with your argument. I don't think you can know either way without scripture. I don't think you can know whether it's a cause or an effect.
You can't know creation is an effect without scripture?
No, I don't think so. I mean, why? That was Russell's criticism of the theistic arguments. How would you know? I mean, if something has to be necessarily existent, why can't we just assume it's the world instead of God? Because
the world undergoes motion.
Okay.
The world is contingent by definition of what it is.
No. I mean,
think about this.
Again, that it's contingent.
No. Think about if something is moved, if something is composed of parts, it is contingent. And if it is contingent, it is an effect.
No, not necessarily. Apparently, I mean, it's just prejudicial bias for you to conclude that something that is in motion cannot be necessarily existent. I mean, on what basis are you claiming that something that is in motion cannot be necessarily existent?
What moved it?
I don't know.
Well, it has to be something, right? Otherwise, you're positing an effect without a cause.
That is what you're supposed to be proving in order to make the argument valid.
But nothing that is in motion can be self-moved or moved through itself.
Why not? You're the one who
because it's right. But when you state something is in motion, something is moving, A is moving from X to Z or something like that.
Okay.
Do you think that something that is in motion can move itself? eternally?
Well, maybe. I mean, I don't have acquaintance with the nature of all existence. So maybe something
Could it
can
potentially not be in motion?
I mean, it could be, yeah. I mean, it could be moving.
So it could or
itself
could
moves,
not be
it's
in
supposed to
motion, which means it's a composition of act and potency.
Okay, well, why can't
It's
something
potentially not in motion, right?
why
But it's
what
actually
is
in
your
motion.
proof
So
of
what
that?
actualized?
What is your proof that something in motion cannot be necessarily existent?
Well, that's what I'm telling you right now, is that if something in motion is composed of act and potency, which it is, because
Well, how do you
you
know
just
it's not?
granted that. You just granted it, that it could possibly not be in motion.
Oh, I was giving just possibilities. Well, is it composition of act and potency? Well, maybe. I mean, that's possible. I'm asking you to prove that that's true, because that's what you're supposed to be doing, is proving this stuff. I'm just saying that when it comes to your arguments and the theistic arguments, what they come down to is, this is one of the more foundational criticisms, is, in a sense, the person who's making them has to be omniscient, because they have to have familiarity with all causes and all effects, or all acts of, or all objects in existence, and has to know whether they're all, act in potency, or how which category they go in, or you have to be so familiar with all objects in existence that you can know that, for example, something in motion cannot be necessarily existent. I mean, there's just, you can't know this stuff. You just have to assume your own omniscience in order to make these arguments work, if they're even valid.
That's only if you're making an inductive argument. But the argument, going back to my argument, it starts with the premise that some things are in motion. Would you agree that some things are in motion?
Yes, I agree with that.
Okay. So you think that that's a valid premise?
I think I can know that in terms of the Christian worldview, yes, because the Christian worldview allows me to give justification for my own sense perception, and I do perceive that.
But people who don't have a Christian worldview understand and know that there are things in motion.
They can't know that in terms of their worldview, but they can know that in terms of the worldview that they suppress.
Okay, so you admit, though, that unbelievers know that things are in motion. You're saying they're inconsistent in that knowledge, but they do know it, right?
They cannot know it in terms of their worldview. They can know it in terms of the worldview, the Christian worldview, the worldview that they know and suppress.
What does that mean? They obviously know it while having a false worldview. They still know that some things are in motion.
Right, but what I think you're trying to do is, you're trying to get me to say, well, unbelievers know things. Right, but you always have to ask, in terms of which worldview are you defining things like knowledge, belief, truth, fact, evidence, proof?
Okay, that's irrelevant, because all I need you to grant is that the unbeliever knows that some things are in motion. Do you grant that?
In terms of the worldview that they suppress, but not in terms of their unbelieving worldview.
Okay, so unbelievers know that some things are in motion.
In terms of the worldview that they suppress,
just
not in terms of their own worldview.
Okay, so they know that some things are in motion. They know them inconsistently. They know these things inconsistently, but yet they know them, right? Unbelievers know things are in motion.
When it comes to the word inconsistency, there are a couple different ways we can use it. You could mean just like a normal logical inconsistency, like if somebody says, well, I believe P and I believe not P. Okay, that's a logical inconsistency. I'm not saying that kind of logical inconsistency, destroys a worldview, because any number of people who are Christians happen to have inconsistent beliefs. I'm also not talking about moral inconsistency in the sense of, like, if somebody says that murder is wrong and then they go commit genocide. That's a moral inconsistency. That's also not what I'm talking about. What I am talking about is a transcendental inconsistency, an inconsistency of worldviews, where they assert something that they cannot justify in terms of their worldview, and yet it can be justified in terms of Christian worldview.
Right. Okay. So they know some things are in motion, in some sense.
Right. And in order to know that,
okay, P2, but that which is in motion is put into motion by another.
Okay. Well, again, in terms of it, if we're talking to Hume here, his unbelieving empiricistic worldview, That is not a premise that can be known.
Okay. So, and you think his critique was valid?
Let me play this out. You don't have familiarity. You don't have acquaintance with all acts of motion. So you don't know if everything.
But the argument doesn't demand that.
Okay.
The argument doesn't demand that.
Hold on. Just let me finish my sentence, okay? In terms of Hume's empiricistic worldview, you don't have acquaintance with all instances of motion. So you don't know that there is not something in motion that is self-existent.
Okay, that's not what the argument's trying to argue for.
You can't affirm premise 2 if you're an unbeliever. You can affirm this if you're a Christian, but if you're a Christian already, then you don't need the argument.
Okay, but that's not what the argument. You mischaracterized the argument like almost totally. So hold on. All right. Okay. So we're on the same page here. The argument doesn't demand that we know every single cause in the universe. It just demands that we admit that there are some things in motion, and that things, be it those things, other things, we know that some things that are in motion do not have motion in and of themselves. They're put into motion through another. That's all it demands. It doesn't demand that I have an exhaustive knowledge. This is a deductive argument. It doesn't demand that I know or have exhaustive knowledge or exhaustive experience of every single instance of motion in the universe.
Okay, hold on. So premise 1 is some things are in motion, correct?
Right.
Premise 2 is something can't be in motion unless it was put in motion by another, correct? And the reason for that is because if you have something, right, if you have something in motion, okay, anything, it could be a ball that I take and throw across the room, it could be the planets out in the universe, it could be galaxies that we have not yet found an explanation for that's in motion. If you have something in motion, there are a few possibilities as to what put it in motion, right? Right.
And it could be moved through itself, which I think if we were to evaluate that, we would see there's problems. It could be moved through another, or it could be eternally moving.
Okay. And you can't know, if you're an empiricist, you can't know which one is correct. You can't discount the existence of any of those because you don't have acquaintance with all instances of motion.
Can I incorporate or employ the dialectical refutation that Hume and Kant and others employ? Because if I can, then I can narrow down which one would be correct.
Well, that would assume the existence of the laws of logic, which if you're a Humean empiricist, you can't verify because you can't verify all instances of logical connections.
Right, but Hume's actually assuming the laws of logic to be able to say that.
Yes, he is, and that's one of the problems I have with Hume's empiricism is it's self-refuting.
Right, so that's actually why I don't take...
His criticism is invalid.
Yeah, I think his criticism is invalid because he's assuming the laws of logic in order to make his criticism. But his criticism rides on skepticism.
Right, he is, yes, I think that you're correct, that Hume has to borrow from the Christian worldview to make his argument work. But the argument is his criticisms are still valid. If you want to make the claim that something in motion was put in motion by another, that's a universal statement. You cannot know that unless you have a...
That's not a universal statement. To say that something is in motion and was put in motion by another, that's not a universal statement.
Well, it is. If you're going to say something cannot be put into motion unless it's put into motion by another, then you're saying all things in motion were put into motion by something else.
Okay.
But you don't know that because you don't have acquaintance with all instances of motion.
Well, okay, so if you posit an infinite movement of something.
Okay.
Okay, so if you posit an infinite movement of something that is infinite is necessary, correct?
I mean, I'll grant it for the sake of argument to see where this goes. I'm not sure I actually think you can know.
Well, I mean, what is something that's infinite? I mean, it's something that exists without a cause, right?
I I mean, infinite, I don't know, not something without finite spatial extension.
Right. It's not finite. It's infinite. Yeah. And if it's infinite, then it's not limited. It's not limited by temporality, for example.
Okay.
Okay. So if something is moving infinitely, eternally, it's necessary.
Well, I think you're conflating something here. I mean, I could conceive of something that is physically finite and yet eternally in motion. I mean, I can think of it. I can't know that if I'm just going off my own unbelieving empiricistic worldview, I can't know that something like that can't exist.
Right, but then that's something that's finite and in motion eternally has a cause.
No,
because it's because something that's
eternally wouldn't have a cause. It's eternally in motion. It wasn't caused to be in motion by anything.
Yeah, well, we're not just talking about linear causality. We're talking about hierarchical causality. Actually, that's what all 5 proofs do. They're not even addressing the linear aspect of causality. They're addressing the hierarchical causal chain, which means that something can be eternally existent and still have a cause. Right? It's got an efficient cause that sustains it as it is. That's the cause. It's not self-existent. It's finite. If it's finite, it's not self-existent. It can't be self-existent if it's finite by definition of what it is.
I mean, if we lived in a universe where the only thing that existed was a physical box and it had always been there eternally, I mean, you could still argue that that's finite, yet still eternally existent.
Well, but it's not self-existent.
Well, why couldn't it be?
Because it has 4 corners, right?
Well, it's physically finite, but if it exists eternally, I mean...
So it has parts that make it what it is. It has parts that cause it. It has parts that cause it to be what it is.
No, I'm asking you to prove that something like that couldn't exist.
No, I'm under no... I don't care if something like that exists. That's not a problem.
I'm just saying
what I'm pointing out to you is that it wouldn't be self-existent.
Sorry, say again?
Yeah, I'm just pointing out to you that it wouldn't be self-existent.
Well, no, I'm positing the existence. I'm positing that is a possibility. I'm saying you can't prove that isn't possible.
Okay.
Something like that being eternally existent isn't impossible in terms of the
eternal existence. Eternal existence and self-existence is not the same thing. Secondly, if that was the case, you could prove the existence of God just from the existence of that box that eternally exists. That's the nature of these arguments. These arguments only need one thing in motion, right? Or in the case of like the argument from contingency, it really only needs one contingent object. It doesn't need the exhaustive series of contingent objects, the exhaustive series of the causal chain in creation. These arguments don't operate like that because they're not inductive arguments that
right.
that make arguments that make conclusions for probability or possibility.
In a sense, I would agree with you there, but I would turn it around and say I have to presuppose God's existence in order for my conception of a contingency or necessity or whatever to be intelligible. If I don't presuppose God's existence, I cannot make those concepts intelligible.
So you agree that the argument is not an inductive argument, that I don't need to have exhaustive knowledge of everything in the universe in order to make this argument?
Well, if what I'm saying is if you're going to say, something like anything that's in motion was put into motion by another, I mean, that's a universal statement. All things in motion, for every X that's in motion, X was put into motion by something else. Why? That's a universal statement, which is the kind of knowledge you can't know in empiricism.
So if you say X is in motion, that's not a universal statement. You're specifying that which is in motion to be X. If you say all things that are in motion...
I understand what the statement is. I'm not saying that X is a universal statement. I'm saying your second premise is the statement, for every X that's in motion, X was put into motion by Y, but by some
Yeah.
other Y. And if you want to put it, I don't know if you're familiar with predicate calculus, but you could put it this way: for every X, there is a Y, such that X wasn't put in motion by Y. That is a universal statement.
Yeah. So when we're talking about motion, we're also not only limiting it to something that's moving, like a car moving down the road, right? So we're talking about it undergoing successive moments, for example. It could be totally still, yet still be considered under motion because it is moving in the sense that it's undergoing a process of successive moments.
Okay.
And so are you saying that Hume, in saying that all things that are moved are moved through something else or are moved by something else, everything that is in motion is moved by something else, he would say that you can't know that, but I would say, what is your basis for doubting that? Like, what is your reasonable doubt?
I'm simply saying that you aren't proving what you're trying to prove. If if somebody wants to say, it might be similar. Here's an analogy, and it might be a rough analogy. If somebody wants to say, well, some guy is guilty of murder. Well, the defense actually doesn't have to prove his innocence. All they have to prove is that the prosecution didn't prove their case, because he's assumed innocent when he walks into
because
the
of the placement of the burden of proof.
You're right. What I'm saying is, if you're going to claim that your argument is valid and that proves God's existence, I'm like, okay, I'll listen. But if all I do is poke holes in the argument, I don't have to prove anything else. All I'm showing you is that you didn't prove your case. And in order to prove your case, you have to have acquaintance with all instances of motion. Otherwise,
but where that ends up, my friend, is the total destruction of science.
Yeah, that's why we have to presuppose the Christian worldview in order to make science work.
Okay. No, it actually destroys your ability to have confidence that you presuppose anything.
No.
It ends really in nothing but solipsism.
No, it doesn't do that.
Yes, it does. Skepticism ends here. Hold on. Let me lay this out for you. Okay. If you doubt everything, right? And you just, well, you're granting that methodology. You're granting that methodology.
I'm doing a reductio. I'm taking your worldview or Hume's worldview or whatever worldview you want to try to make this argument work. I am taking it and showing you this runs into the ground and destroys itself and doesn't work. That does not mean that I myself am a skeptic. I think you can save science and you can save rationality, but you have to presuppose the Christian worldview in order to do it.
Right. Okay. But you're using skeptical tools to. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
To deny something that you would grant is true.
Right. I grant that God exists.
All right.
I am saying that your argument doesn't prove it.
And what I'm saying is that if you grant the validity of Hume's skepticism, you're granting a nonsensical critique that ends someone in total skepticism, in the inability to know anything. And so I could turn Hume's skepticism back on you and your presuppositional methodology. And I'd say, if you're skeptical of this, let's just push that back just a little bit more to your actual ability to ratiocinate. So, for example, you have to apprehend and understand your presupposition of God, right?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So why do you what is the warrant that you have? What is your evidence that you believe or presuppose the Christian God?
Because I don't think it's possible to make intelligible any fact in the universe unless I do that.
Okay. Why? What is your reason for believing that?
It would be twofold. It's sometimes mischaracterized as an inductive argument where, you destroy worldview 1, worldview 2, worldview 3, and, Christianity is what's left. I don't think that's what's going on. I think what is guaranteed by the methodology or the procedure that I engage in is Romans 1. Paul says that if you don't believe in God, you become vain in your reasonings. And I think what he's getting at there, I could go into more detail, but I think what he's getting at there is that, he doesn't say moral reasonings or religious reasonings, or he doesn't confine it at all. He just says reasonings in general. So if you presuppose any worldview other than Christianity, you become vain in your reasonings. You become, mired in internal contradictions and whatnot. So that happens with Hinduism, and I can show somebody that that's true. I can, if they tell me they're a Hindu, I can show that's true with Hinduism. I've studied Hinduism. I can do the same thing with Mormonism. I've read the Book of Mormon. I could show atheists that, I've read Russell and Hume and Quine and Anthony Flew. So I could show atheists that as well. So I could give you individual instances of that general procedure. But that doesn't mean it's an inductive argument. I think it's true because that's what the Bible says.
Okay, but playing with Hume's skepticism, of course, this isn't me. I'm just using his method to show you how it works on your system. So I'm turning it back on you. Okay, so what's the reason that the Bible is true?
Because it's the Word of God.
What's the reason that you think it's the Word of God?
Well, it says it is.
What's your reason that you believe that what it says is true?
Because if I presuppose any other worldview, it destroys the ability to make any assertion at all.
But in order to do that, you have to have knowledge, intimate, exhaustive knowledge of what every other worldview is.
No, I don't have to have exhaustive knowledge, I don't think.
You actually do, because you're saying that because of the falsity of every other worldview, I know mine's correct. Well, in order to know if every other worldview is false, you have to know every other worldview.
Josh, I specifically said that is not the argument. I told you it's not an inductive argument. It's not, I destroyed worldview 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to 10, and Christianity, what's left. That is not the argument. The argument is, in Romans 1, if you don't believe in God...
How do you know the Bible's true?
Because if I don't presuppose it, I can't know anything.
How do you know that?
Because it's true. Okay, let me point out here's where you're going wrong with.
So I'm just taking the same standard you were trying to press. No, this is here. Let me explain. Let me explain.
Okay.
I'm showing you, brother, that Hume's critique is something that you and I should totally dispose with and not even take it seriously. Because if you were to take it and apply it to everything, your position included, my position, anybody else's position, you're going to end up in what we might call total skepticism.
Okay.
And I don't think it's a valid critique, because I think that you have to have reasonable doubt. You have to have a reason to doubt something. And if you don't have, I need a reason. If I pass by a speed limit sign that says 45, I need a reason to doubt that speed limit sign really exists, right? Like, I can't just go on doubting things. I can't pull a Descartes and just go and start doubting things for the sake of doubting, right? And I think that's a totally invalid way to approach epistemology and to approach the reality that is around us, for this very reason right here. Because you ended up where I ended up in terms of applying Hume's critique.
No, I don't think that's true. So when it comes
to... I could just stand here, Seth, and I could say, this argument is true because it's true. But that's not good enough.
Well, it's kind of like asking, how do you know it's true that God exists? Well, he does. He's self-existent. Well, how do you know that? Because he's self-existent. Well, how do you know that's true? Because it's true. I mean, at some point, the wheels start spinning, no matter which worldview you go to. The problem with the way you're applying Hume's skepticism, here's how use Hume's skepticism. I think his critiques of the theistic arguments are actually correct. I don't think the theistic arguments correctly, validly, rationally actually prove God's existence. So his critiques are correct. And yes, you're correct. If I adopted his skepticism actually, then yeah, that would make me unable to prove. I think his skepticism is self-refuting. If he says that the only truths that we can know are truths that are known empirically. That itself is a truth that cannot be known empirically, which means, according to his own worldview, we must reject it. His worldview, his empiricism is self-refuting. I get that. I don't adopt his empiricism. So trying to use his empiricism to refute my Christianity is problematic because his worldview is self-refuting. That does not mean that his criticisms of the theistic arguments are invalid. His criticisms of the theistic arguments are invalid, but he himself, in his worldview, actually wouldn't be able to account for why his criticisms are valid because he would have no basis for knowing that the laws of logic are true, for example.
See, and I think what's been demonstrated here, though, is that if they're valid for the theistic proofs, they are valid for your methodology as well.
No,
which is why I think you should turn around and start defending the theistic proofs against Hume, and I think there's a way to do that.
Well, I don't think
because if it's an applicable critique for the theistic proofs, then it's an applicable critique of your method as well.
Why?
Well, I just demonstrated how that's the case.
Well,
I mean, if you
hold on. What you demonstrated was, in terms of Hume's worldview, you can't know anything, and as far as like, does God exist? In terms of Hume's skepticism, no, you can't know that. Can you know that the Bible is the Word of God? No, you can't know that. You can't know causality. You can't know the existence of the soul. You can't know that the laws of logic are valid. That's what you demonstrated. What you didn't demonstrate is that my methodology is incorrect. You didn't demonstrate that I can't know that God exists and the Bible is the Word of God. You just demonstrated
you couldn't give reasons. You couldn't give justification for your belief that God existed. That's what was shown.
Because I don't grant the premise of Hume's skepticism because it's a self.
Well, I don't either.
But his criticisms of the theistic arguments are valid. But in terms of his worldview, he actually couldn't fully account for how he's able to do that because he can't demonstrate that the laws of logic are true. That doesn't prove that my methodology
his criticisms of the theistic proofs are as valid against the theistic. His criticisms are against the theistic proofs are as valid as they are against your position. Now, what you've done is you've moved the goalposts, and you've said, well, when it's applied to my position, it just goes to show how, on his suppositions, he can't know anything.
Mm-hmm.
But somehow, when it's applied to the theistic proofs, it's valid. And I would like to know where that is. How that distinction is explained.
It's not a matter of moving the goalpost. When it comes down to it, okay, fine. Remove Hume's remove Hume from the equation for a second. That second premise, okay, you can't know that. You can't say for every object X that's in motion, it was moved. There exists a Y that put it into motion. It's a universal statement. I want you to prove that you can account for your usage of the laws of logic without presupposing God's existence. Show me what view of reality are you using that can account for the laws of logic without presupposing God.
I'm not trying to argue for the laws of logic. That's the difference.
Well, then how do you know they're true? How do you know they apply to premise 2?
Well, so you don't argue for the laws of logic either. You employ them in your reasoning, which is what this argument is doing. Huh?
I think I can also prove that they're true.
I think through something like dialectic refutation, you can prove that the laws of logic must be true. But they're not proven by way of modus ponens or modus tollens.
Right.
And the reason for that is obviously because you'd have to assume the laws of logic in that process of reasoning. So,
yes,
so logic.
What is the justified basis for that assumption in your worldview? If you're not going to presuppose God at the very outset, what is your justification for believing that the laws of logic are true at all?
Well, so what do you mean by presuppose God?
When I say presuppose God, I'm saying that what we do is, first of all, we believe in God. What we end up doing in our suppression of that truth is we convince ourselves that we don't believe in Him.
Okay, so
we have to believe in God's existence in order for any other belief to be justified.
Okay,
that's what I mean by presuppose.
So can an unbeliever use the laws of logic? Do they use the laws of logic successfully ever?
Van Til once put it this way, that unbelievers can count, and they frequently count very well. What they cannot do is account for their counting.
Okay. Yeah, there's nobody disagrees with that they can't account for their counting, right? Like if you ask them what is the basis for something like mathematics, they can't account for that on an unbelieving suppositional framework. Nobody's denying that. But
why do you appeal to that to try to convince them that God exists?
What's that?
If you think that they cannot account for their usage of the laws of logic, it sounds like you're on my side. I mean, that's what I agree with. I mean, that's why the theistic arguments fail, because they don't you don't presuppose the laws of logic at the outset. They
do presuppose the laws of logic at the outset. That's the whole thing. You can't make them if you.
I misspoke. Why you're saying that unbelievers cannot account for their counting? Okay.
Right.
Well, the theistic arguments presuppose that they can, because they employ the law.
No, they don't. No, they don't. All the theistic arguments assume is that they can count. That's all they assume. It doesn't assume that they can account for their counting. It just assumes that they can count. That's the whole process of the theistic proofs.
Then the proof is still. I mean, the proof is still invalid. Again, the natural supernatural distinction. Causes in the world don't necessarily prove anything about the causes for the world. The quantification fallacy, you can't know that, you can't actually know that every cause has an event, or every effect has a cause. I mean, there are multiple problems with the theistic arguments just on the logical level.
Every effect has a cause. If it doesn't have a cause, it's not an effect.
Well, yes, and that's analytically true. And if you make it an analytical truth, you can't know that it actually applies to reality.
Right, because words have meaning, my friend. The other thing is on the supernatural and natural distinction.
Words have meaning, but you can't know that if you're just going to make it an analytical truth, you can't know that it actually applies to reality.
I don't make it an analytical truth. If something is an effect, right, and it's not, and when we're talking about an effect, we're not just talking about a word applied to a thing nominally. That would be nominalism. We're not nominalists. I'm not a nominalist. Okay.
I'm not either.
The word effect is a word we use to describe a concept, right? That is something that has been caused. And so if I say that something is an effect, what I'm doing in my language, in my predication, is I'm just describing something that has been caused. And so that's why. So when I say if it is an effect, it has a cause. If it's not an effect, it doesn't have a cause, and that's fine. You can deny that something is an effect, and that's fine. The law of causality doesn't require that everything be an effect. It just requires that every effect has a cause. So
okay, let me grant a little bit and still show you that there's a problem with this. So let's say in terms of your experience, you were able to verify that every effect has a cause. You looked in your entire personal experience, and you were able to give an explanation for every effect that you saw. What is your basis for believing that that the cause-effect relationship is, assuming that that it's true in your personal experience, what is your basis for believing that it applies to unexperienced instances or unexperienced facts? You couldn't know that unless you presuppose the worldview of Christianity, in which
I guess I don't understand. Well, I guess I don't even understand the relevance of the question, since that's not what the argument is trying to do or achieve.
Well, because premise 2 is a universal statement. You don't
premise 2. Premise. No. Whoa. Premise 2. Okay, so if you were to say all contingent things require a cause, okay, would you agree with that? I mean, I think you granted that earlier on in this conversation that all contingent things require a cause.
I do think it's true, but I think it's something that I could only justify
Okay.
in terms of the worldview.
So that's okay. That's okay. All I need you to do is grant that you think it's true. That's a universal statement. All right.
Yes.
And the reason you can make that kind of a universal statement is because if something is contingent, right, it is by definition that which is dependent on something else to be what it is. All right.
Okay.
So
that goes back to criticism earlier about, if you say every A requires a B, well, I can say that that's an analytical statement. Okay, sure, but how do I know that either concept has?
No, that's a synthetic statement. That's not an analytical statement.
No, a synthetic statement has to do with
if an A is that which requires a B, right?
Mm-hmm.
If an A necessarily results in or requires a B, that would be an analytical statement. But then again, the things that applies to depends on the circumstance. So for example, Bertrand Russell, John Stuart Mill, I think even David Hume a little bit misunderstood the principle of causality. And really, instead of saying, every effect requires a cause, they're saying everything requires a cause, or they're assuming that it means everything requires a cause, and that's just not true. Hence the, rhetorical zinger. Then what caused God, right? Well, God's not an effect.
Well, how do you know
okay,
that?
So through something like
is you have to constantly distinguish between, am I answering this in the Christian worldview, or am I answering it in terms of whatever worldview you're trying
No. So I actually deny that distinction, and I deny the worldview language. That's not my epistemology, and I don't think that's the Bible's epistemology either. And that'd be a whole other discussion, and probably might be where we should have gone first. But the idea that an analytical statement is a nonsense statement is essentially what you're saying.
No, I'm not. I wouldn't go that far. I'm simply saying, when it comes to your discussion of cause and effect, we're talking about two different things here. So if you look at your own personal experience and you say, okay, cause and effect relationships, I see that in my personal experience with the events and causes that I have acquaintance with. And then you say, well, I have this analytical statement that says every effect has a cause. Okay, those are two different things. You can't tell me that you know that those are the same kind of thing, because you're saying, well, it's you're
nobody's claiming they're the same kind of thing. Nobody's claiming they're the same kind of thing.
Hold on. You're simply assuming that those concepts apply to facts that you don't have acquaintance with. But that's what we're trying to prove, is that they're universally true. You're simply assuming that they're universally true based on your own experience.
Again, that's not what the argument does. That's just simply not what the argument does. If you take the law of causality, for example, you're not assuming that everything is an effect.
No, I'm not saying that's what you're saying. I'm saying
okay.
The law of causality means every effect has a cause.
Right. So if you want to deny premise 2 in the argument, that which is in motion is put into motion by another.
I'm not saying I deny it. I'm saying you can't prove it. There's a difference.
Okay. Why?
Does that make sense? I'm simply because you're simply assuming, without being able to prove it, that the facts that you don't have acquaintance with have enough similarity with the facts that you do have acquaintance with, such that the universal statement holds. You're simply assuming.
No. I just need some things. I just need some things to be in motion, and the premise 2 is that those things that are in motion are moved by another.
No, you've admitted several times premise 2 is a universal statement. It's not a some SSP statement. It's an all SSP kind of statement.
Well, it actually follows from premise 1, and premise 1 only demands that some things are in motion. Okay,
no, I
so
don't
so
think it follows from premise two or from premise one. It's supposed to be a premise. It's not supposed to be a conclusion from premise one.
okay, I understand that, but it builds on premise one. That's what premises are in a syllogism.
Sure. Yeah, you use premises to prove things.
Okay, so whenever premise two says, but that which is in motion, it's talking about those things that are in motion. There are some things in motion. That which is in motion is moved by another.
Yeah, then that's a universal statement which you can't know based on the way you're approaching this. You're
Okay,
simply assuming that experienced events have similarity to experienced events, events that you've experienced, and you're simply asserting that they have that same cause and effect relationship. I'm saying you can't know that unless you presuppose the Christian worldview.
yeah, but it's not dependent on empirical verification of every instance of motion. That's
No,
not
I'm
the
not saying
argument.
it is.
Well, you
know it's
did.
not.
You actually did. You said I can't know premise two. I can't know premise two without having exhaustive experience,
Well, that would be one way to know it.
which would verify that that would be the case.
Right. That would be one way to know it, is to have omniscience and have acquaintance with all effects and all causes. I'm saying from you have your own experience, your own acquaintance with a cause and effect facts, and the premise two simply assumes that the unexperienced facts are going to be similar to the unexperienced, or to the ones you've already experienced. But that's an assumption. It's not something you can prove. And again, it's not something. Again, I'm going back to, I'm not denying premise two. I think premise two can be known, justified in terms of the Christian worldview, but it cannot be known in terms of the way that you are approaching the argument.
Well, here's the problem is that doesn't really make sense. If it can just be known. Okay, so you're talking about access of knowledge, essentially, and that's a whole other rabbit trail that we could go down.
I'm sure it's
all it does is it builds on premise one, right? So, but that which is in motion is put into motion by another, and
right.
I don't need everything to be in motion or put into motion by another. The argument doesn't require everything to be put into motion by another. Although, going back to what I said earlier about 45 minutes ago at this point, there are basically three options that you have, right? Yeah. Either it's put into motion by itself, it's eternally in motion, or it's put into motion by another.
Okay. Here's what I want you to prove to me. I'll just, for the sake of argument, I'll grant Josh knows and understands the cause and effect relationships in his own experience well enough to know that every effect has a cause. I want you to show me a line of reasoning that will prove, therefore, every effect has a cause, even ones that Josh does not have acquaintance with.
What is an effect? Define effect. No. You're the one that's wanting me to demonstrate it, so define effect.
No, I'm allowing you to define it and demonstrate it in the way you can define cause and effect how you want to in terms of your. I'm simply asking you,
if what an effect is essentially is that which has a cause, then every effect has a cause. It doesn't require demonstration.
Okay, that definition. How do you know that concept of cause and effect? How do you know that applies to facts and experiences that you are not acquainted with?
Okay, I don't need it to apply to everything.
You do if you want premise two to be a universal statement.
No, I only need it to apply to effects. Which it does analytically. This is the difference between an analytic and a synthetic statement. So if an effect just is that which has a cause, then every effect has a cause. It doesn't require a demonstration.
How do you know that procedure applies not just to your the facts that you have acquaintance with, but also the ones you don't have acquaintance with? That's what I'm trying to get at.
I don't need it to, because again, this is not an inductive argument. This is a deductive argument that has a necessary conclusion that flows from the premises.
That's what I'm saying. Premise two is a universal statement, and I'm saying, well, how do you know it's actually truly universal? And then you're saying, well, I don't need it to apply to everything. Well, if you want it to remain a universal statement, yes, you do.
I actually don't need it to remain a universal statement. But if you want to go back to, but if you want it to, but if you want it, but if
you are close to a valid argument if you do that.
it actually doesn't have to be understood as a universal statement within the context of the argument that I've put forth. And the same is true for Thomas's first way. It doesn't have to be taken that way. You were the one that took it that way, and you didn't understand that it's within the context of premise one already. But you can prove.
Statement, go for it. I'd love to hear.
You can prove through dialectic refutation that everything that is in motion must have a cause, right, or must be moved by another.
That's still a universal statement.
Okay, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that's easy to prove through dialectic refutation.
Okay.
And we talked about that earlier. There's only three ways that something can be moved. It can be eternally moved, it can be moved through itself, or it can be moved by another.
Okay. How do you know 1 and 2 don't apply?
What's that?
How do you know that 1 and 2 don't apply to any objects?
We have already covered why 2 doesn't apply. A finite object that's moving eternally is still a finite object and thus requires a cause. Number 1 doesn't apply because something cannot be moved through itself. It can be moved.
Why not?
It can be moved by a part that it has, right? Like, so for example, you might say that a butterfly flies on its own, right? And in that sense is self-moved. That's not what I would be meaning when I say that something is self-moved. A butterfly requires a lot of things in order to move. It requires its wings, it requires its energy, it requires its life, it requires space, it requires a host of things, food, oxygen, a host of things in order to be able to do what it does. So it's not self-moved. So something cannot. What's that?
How do you know self-moving objects don't exist? You don't know everything.
Right, and I don't have to know every single object in all intimacy in order to know that there is no such thing as a self-moving object. Unless, of course, you want to appeal to the inter-Trinitarian movement. What's that?
If you want to say no self-moving object exists, well then yeah, you have to have acquaintance with all objects in order to know that absolutely none of them is self-moving.
No, because motion in and of itself is an effect.
You're presupposing that concept applies to all objects that you do not have acquaintance with, but that's what you're supposed to be proving.
If something is in motion, right, it is an effect, and it's either self-affected, which would mean it's its own cause. That doesn't make any sense.
Why not?
Or it's been eternally moving, which doesn't make any sense either. Huh?
You don't have acquaintance with all moving objects, so you can't know that there isn't one in existence that is self-moving.
That's like saying, well, you don't have an acquaintance with every effect in the universe, so you can't know that that everything is an effect, right? Or you don't have an acquaintance with everything that is caused, so you can't really know if everything or if every effect has a cause.
Well, I think that's true.
You think it's true that there are some effects, that there could be some effects that don't have a cause?
Well, if you do your analytical statement and define every effect as having a cause, well, then of course every effect has a cause. But you still
how else would you define effect?
But you still don't have a basis for assuming that statement or that claim applies to all objects in existence. So
I don't need it to. I don't need it to. That's not what the argument's doing.
I'm saying you can't have it both ways. If you just make a universal statement about causes and effects, well, if all you have is your own personal acquaintance and experience to make the basis for this claim, then you can't know that every cause. Again, this is the basis for Hume's criticism. He was constantly talking about the only reason that some people are able to make sense of something is because they assume that there's enough of a similarity between objects and experiences that they do not have acquaintance with, there's enough of a similarity between those and experiences that they do have acquaintance with, such that there's enough similarities such that universal statements can apply. But as far as actually proving it, if all you have is your own experience to prove something, you're not going to be able to prove much.
But the argument doesn't require empirical verification of every instance that you are trying to make it require. You're demanding something. In other words, you're demanding something of the argument that it doesn't claim to meet.
Maybe
Right.
I can put it this way. One thing that Russell pointed out is if you have the really simplistic syllogism, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. He actually points out that if all you have is your own personal experience, you can't actually prove that all men are mortal.
Right, and that's not right. That what he would be objecting to is the definition of man, right?
Well, yeah,
so
but that becomes a problem, because if you define man as mortal, then that just brings the question back to, how do you know your definition actually applies to all of the beings that you believe are men? I mean, if it's just a definition you come up with in your mind, then how do you apply it applies to unexperienced realities?
That is okay. Look, a man is a living being, right? Is a living person.
Living being, or are you saying that all
see, but this goes to show the effect and the cause, right? So one of the problems is that you're moving from the statement itself into interrogating the definitions of the terms, right?
Okay.
And when we make the statement, every effect has a cause, we've already granted the definitions, but you've taken a step back and you've begun to question the definitions, right?
Well,
so the statement, but the statement as it's defined, as those two terms are defined, is correct.
Okay, maybe I can put it this way. Going back to the example with Russell, if you say that,
well, no, I want to know from you before we go somewhere else.
Okay.
As effect and as cause are defined, the statement is analytical. It's analytically true.
Yes. If you make an analytical statement, it's analytical, sure.
Okay. So regardless of whether or not you find problems with the definition of said word, the argument still is valid and sound.
I still wouldn't grant that. No, I think it has other
Why?
problems later in the discussion.
Like what?
Well, we haven't gotten past premise. I mean, I've already explained some of the the causes in the world versus causes for the world, supernatural versus natural. I might be able to get some of the other.
Well, I actually want to go back to that because we never got past that distinction that you made. That's another demand that you've placed on the argument that it again never claims to meet, is that distinction between the natural and the supernatural. So if you let's say, okay, let's grant that the argument that the premises, just travel with me for a moment, just for the sake of argument, and you get to the conclusion, therefore a first mover exists, right? Your contention earlier on in the thread was that the first mover would only be natural.
Yes, because all the premises.
It could only be natural. Okay.
Well,
and that there would actually.
If all of the premises deal in natural causation, then
okay, why could it only be natural?
Because that's what the premises are talking about. They're talking about natural, natural hand, natural stick, natural ball. That's what the premises are all dealing with, is natural causation, which means if you draw a supernaturalistic conclusion, you're going beyond what the premises can prove.
Okay, prove the distinction between natural and supernatural causation.
Sorry,
like parse out what that means. The difference between natural and supernatural causation.
Well, God is the supernatural cause of everything. And then natural causation is what we commonly see as natural causation. Hand moves,
Yeah.
stick hits ball, ball moves. That's natural causation within the created order.
Okay, and you granted earlier that creation is an effect, that is contingent.
I think if you're talking about supernatural causation, God is the supernatural cause and the effect, if you want to call it that. I think it's kind of a strange term for creation, but if you're talking supernatural causation, then yes, God is the cause, the world is the effect.
Okay, well, if the world is an effect, if the world is contingent, right? That is, if at bottom it's composed of like act and potency, then it is by definition an effect, and it requires a cause. There's, of necessity, it requires a cause that's outside of itself.
Yes, I believe that's true. In terms of the Christian worldview, using the
well,
terminology, that's true.
No, because it actually logically goes there by necessity.
Not unless you presuppose the Christian worldview, but go ahead.
You cannot. Okay, so if you admit that the creation, that this cosmos is contingent, it moves, it's composed. At bottom, it's composed of act and potency. Its essence, its existence is distinct. It's contingent. Everything about it is contingent. And let's even throw in that it is a finite or natural causal series, right? Because it moves. We just talked about that. It moves. You know, you've talked about how there's causes within the natural order, right? And that's why this argument supposedly only applies to here, is because it's dealing with natural causation, right? So there's a causal series within the natural world. And that causal series, because it is a contingent causal series, it's a causal series of contingent causes, you might say, requires a cause itself, right? It doesn't matter how many causes that you have within a contingent causal series, it never becomes its own necessary cause, its own necessary explanation. You need an explanation behind it, which was the sum and substance of Father Copleston and Bertrand Russell's discussion, their debate that they had. And one of the things Copleston points out to Russell was that if you take the natural world by itself, and you're willing to admit that it is a compendium of a natural causal series or natural causes, then that needs a necessary cause. That requires a necessary cause. And in that way, the argument demonstrates that distinction between natural and supernatural, the unnatural being unable to reason to the supernatural through the effects that's found within nature. The argument, if anything, proves that that's a false distinction. You know what I mean?
So there's no distinction between creator and creature?
No, I don't deny that at all. There's obviously a distinction between creator and creature.
That's the distinction I was making.
Okay, but you would admit that a universe that is full of contingent causes requires itself a cause. That's the first mover.
If by that you mean the supernatural cause God, who is distinct from creation, that supernatural cause, yes, I think would be necessary.
Yes. That's the only. In fact, that's the only conclusion. That's the only conclusion that you can come to.
We're talking about
two
different things. We're talking about a first cause in creation.
A first cause of creation has to be God.
First cause in creation is what I said.
Oh no. You've already admitted that creation is contingent, and you can demonstrate that through creation, through nature itself.
You're putting words in my mouth. Creation is contingent because it was created by God. If I don't already know that it was created by God, I can't know that it's contingent. I mean, it may as well be there are philosophies that say that the world is eternal. So it's it's not contingent on anything. It necessarily exists. So I would determine that the world is either contingent or necessary depending on what worldview I presuppose to begin with.
Are there contingent effects in this world? Are there contingent causes in this world?
Yes, but I'm answering as a Christian, so I presuppose the Christian worldview.
Okay. It doesn't matter what you answer as, my friend. An unbeliever could answer that question in the affirmative. Am I right? I've never actually heard an atheist say that there was nothing that there was nothing contingent in this world, right? So this is something that's a proposition that both Christian and atheist can agree with. That there are contingent things in this universe.
Depending on what you mean by contingent, then yes. If you're talking about in terms of supernatural causation, then everything in creation is contingent.
Okay. Contingency just means dependent on something else, right?
Yeah, and Russell's point is that you don't know whether the world is the contingency or that upon which everything else is contingent. It might necessarily exist. You can't know beforehand whether one or the other is the case.
Okay. The problem with what Russell said is that he's ignoring the fact that he's talking about a contingent causal series, but then he denies that there is a cause for that effect, because a contingent causal series is an effect. It's contingent. Series.
Okay.
Right, and Copleston's point in the debate was that you cannot have a contingent causal series ad infinitum, because that's deposit and effect without a cause. What?
How would you prove that you can't have an infinite regress? There are philosophies that would find that acceptable, such as Hinduism, which has reincarnation scenarios and the circularity in their world.
Can you quantify it? Okay, can you quantify it?
What do you mean quantify?
Can you quantify anything in this creation?
Sure.
Then it's not infinite. Even Hindus would grant that you could quantify things in this creation. I mean, Indians are very good at counting.
Yes, there are a lot of really good Indian mathematicians, but that's because the reason they can be such good mathematicians is they're not very good at their own Hinduism, because Hinduism teaches that logical distinctions are illusory.
Right. So they demonstrate through their own practical living that their own religion is false.
Yes.
When you say that you can quantify something, when you say that you can quantify something, you are admitting that it's not infinite. That which is infinite cannot be quantified.
Somebody could say, well, I think things can be quantified, but also we live in a chance universe. Well, you can't have both. That's the transcendental inconsistency I was talking about earlier. The worldview of chance cannot account for logical distinctions.
I agree.
There are people who very well and have an essentially a chance worldview.
Well, Seth, I think we got to wrap it up, man. Thanks for coming on here for almost 2 hours. I'm having a hard time hearing you now. You're clicking a little bit. I don't know if it's your cord or what.
I'm not sure.
But anyway, maybe we can do this again sometime. Again, thanks for your time. All right, brother. See you.